When our HOA tried to force us to tear down our late son's memorial garden, we thought we had no way to fight back. We never imagined his godfather, the state's governor, would show up and change everything. If you want more powerful, real-life stories of standing up for what matters, like this video and subscribe for the next chapter. I never imagined that a small patch of earth in my front yard could mean so much. When I first moved into this neighborhood with my husband, I thought of the yard as just another responsibility. Grass to mow, weeds to pull, hedges to trim before the HOA sent one of their neatly worded reminders. But everything changed the day we lost our son. There are moments in life when the world tilts in a way you can never set right again. And for me, that day was the one when the phone call came. When the words did not even make sense at first. When the numbness was so thick I could barely breathe. In the weeks that followed, I found myself wandering outside, staring at the same patch of lawn, trying to figure out what to do with my hands, how to stand upright without falling apart. It was my husband who first suggested planting something. He knew how I had always loved gardening in a casual way, how I could lose hours to pulling weeds and tucking in seedlings. But this was different. This was not a hobby or a pastime. This would be a living tribute, a place where we could sit and remember, where we could watch things grow in a world that had otherwise gone dark. I pictured flowers that he had loved, or at least the bright colors he had pointed at when we walked through the farmer's market. I thought of a small stone bench where I could sit in the quiet mornings before the neighborhood was awake. I thought of a plaque, something simple with his name and a few words that might capture the warmth he brought to everyone he met. When I told a few of our neighbors, they nodded in sympathy. A couple even offered to help dig and plant. No one mentioned rules or policies. It was just an act of kindness in the face of something unthinkable. On the first Saturday in April, we went to the nursery and picked out a mix of perennials and annuals, bright marigolds, purple coneflowers, daisies, and lavender. I chose a small dogwood tree for the center, imagining how in a few years its branches would spread wide, offering shade and pale blossoms in the spring. We spent the entire day outside, knees in the dirt, hands stained with soil, working in the sun until our backs ached. When the garden was finished, I felt something I had not felt in months. It was not joy exactly, but a quiet sense of rightness. The bench was placed so you could see the flowers from every angle, and the plaque sat at the base of the tree. I began to visit it every morning with my coffee. I would talk to him there in a way I could not manage in the house. Sometimes I would just sit in silence, letting the breeze carry the scent of lavender and the sound of the leaves moving gently overhead. For a little while, it seemed like the garden brought something good not just to us, but to the street as a whole. I saw neighbors pause as they walked by, leaning in to look at the flowers. Some left little things without saying a word. A seashell, a tiny stone with a painted heart, a folded note. I was grateful for the kindness, and I thought perhaps this place would always be a part of our home. But in the background, I began to notice subtle signs that not everyone shared the same feeling. One morning I saw a woman I did not know standing across the street, taking pictures with her phone. She wore a frown as if she were inspecting something she disliked. She did not speak to me, only turned and walked away when she saw me looking. I thought little of it at the time. After all, people take photos for many reasons. But a week later, a folded piece of paper was left at our door. It was not signed, and it was not unkind exactly, but it was unsettling in its precision. It mentioned that the yard's appearance had changed significantly, that some residents preferred the uniform look of lawns and hedges, and that the garden might be a distraction from the neighborhood's overall aesthetic. I read it twice before setting it down, unsure if I should even take it seriously. I told myself that grief can make you see things in sharper contrast, that maybe I was imagining the undercurrent of disapproval. I went back to tending the flowers, pulling weeds and adding mulch. The dogwood began to push out new leaves, and I felt a small spark of pride each time I saw it. But deep down, I sensed something was shifting. When certain cars passed, I noticed the drivers would slow just a little, as if assessing. Conversations with a few neighbors began to feel oddly clipped, polite but cool. Still, I did not believe anything would come of it. The garden was on our property, paid for with our own money, and it hurt no one. More than that, it was sacred to us, a physical space where our son's memory could live in sunlight and open air. I held on to the belief that common sense and compassion would be enough to keep it safe. What I did not yet understand was that for some people, rules were not about fairness or community, but about control. And once such a person decided something was unacceptable, they would not stop until it was gone. At night, I would sometimes step outside with a cup of tea and sit on the bench under the porch light. The street would be quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. I would watch the shadows move across the petals and think of all the mornings I hoped to have there, all the seasons I imagined passing as the flowers bloomed and faded and bloomed again. It was, in my mind, a promise not to let the world forget him. It never occurred to me that this promise might become the center of a battle I never wanted to fight. I met her for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring. The sun was warm, the garden was in full bloom, and I was kneeling beside the dogwood tree, trimming back a cluster of marigolds that had grown thick enough to lean into the bench. I remember hearing the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk and looking up to see a woman in a crisp white blouse and navy slacks, her hair pulled so tightly back that not a strand moved in the breeze. She was holding a clipboard and wore the kind of sunglasses that hide not just the eyes but the expression behind them. She did not smile. Instead, she paused just outside our walkway, tilting her head as though examining something she could not quite identify. Her voice was sharp when she spoke, not loud but laced with a firmness that felt rehearsed. She introduced herself as a member of the Homeowners Association board, saying her name as if it carried a certain weight I should recognize. She commented on how unusual the yard looked now compared to the last time she had walked this street. I explained that it was a memorial garden for our son, that it had been a project of love and healing. Her face did not change. She glanced at the bench, then at the plaque, and finally at the flowers, and she nodded once in a way that seemed less like agreement and more like confirmation of something she had already decided. She asked if we had submitted a request to the HOA before altering the landscaping. I told her that the garden was on our own property and that it had not occurred to me that we would need to ask permission to plant flowers or put in a bench. She smiled in a way that was not kind. She explained that the HOA had guidelines for maintaining a cohesive appearance throughout the neighborhood, and that even small changes were supposed to be approved in writing. I said I was not aware of such a rule and that I doubted a flower bed and a small tree would be an issue for anyone. She did not respond to that directly. She simply made a note on her clipboard and said she would be in touch. Over the next few days, I noticed her car passing by more often than before. Sometimes she would slow down. Sometimes she would stop at the corner and make a note before driving off. A week after that first meeting, we received a formal letter from the HOA. It was printed on thick paper and written in precise legal language. The letter stated that the garden constituted an unapproved modification to the property and was therefore in violation of the community's landscaping standards. It requested that we remove the garden within 30 days to bring the property back into compliance. There was no mention of our son, no acknowledgement that this was anything other than a matter of aesthetics. I took the letter to the next HOA meeting, hoping to explain in person what the garden meant to us. The meetings were held in a small room at the community center, with long tables pushed together in a rectangle and folding chairs arranged for residents to sit and watch. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at the center of the board side of the table with her clipboard in front of her. Her hair and clothes looked exactly as they had the day she came to our house. She glanced at me briefly and then looked down at her papers. When the open comment section began, I stood and introduced myself. I told them about our son and about how the garden had given us a place to remember him. I described the flowers, the bench, and the tree. I said that it was not just decoration, but a part of our healing. I asked them to consider allowing it to remain as it was. The room was quiet when I finished. A couple of board members shifted in their seats, one looking down as though uncomfortable. She was the one who responded. She thanked me for sharing, but said that rules existed for a reason, and that exceptions could not be made based on individual circumstances without risking disorder in the community's appearance. She spoke in a calm, deliberate tone that left no space for argument. The board voted on whether to issue an official removal order. She raised her hand first, and the others followed except for one man who abstained. The motion passed, and she noted the result in her papers with the same expression she had worn all along. As I gathered my things to leave, she caught my eye and gave a small, tight smile that felt almost like triumph. After that meeting, her presence became harder to ignore. She walked past our house more often, sometimes stopping to take photos, sometimes pretending to check her phone while looking directly at the garden. Once I stepped outside while she was there, and she quickly resumed walking without speaking to me. Her car was often parked near the end of our street, and I began to feel as though she was monitoring us. Neighbors started to notice the tension. Some asked quietly how things were going, their voices low as if they feared being overheard. A few told me they thought the garden was beautiful and that the HOA should leave it alone, but none of them offered to speak at a meeting. I could not tell whether it was loyalty to her, fear of conflict, or simply a desire to avoid getting involved. One afternoon I came home to find another letter taped to our door. This one was shorter, stating simply that the 30 days were almost up and that failure to comply would result in fines. The amount was listed in bold print. My husband and I sat at the kitchen table with the letter between us, trying to decide what to do. He wanted to fight it, but I felt the weight of her persistence pressing down on me. She was not going to let this go. She seemed determined to prove something, though I could not understand what it was. That night I stood in the garden longer than usual. The air was warm, and the scent of lavender drifted up as I brushed my hands over the plants. I thought about the way she had looked at the garden that first day, the way she seemed to measure it, not in beauty or meaning, but in how well it fit, a set of rules written in a binder somewhere. I thought about the vote at the meeting and the silence of the other board members. I realized then that this was not just about flowers or a bench or a tree. This was about control, about someone who had found a way to impose her will on others and was not willing to be told no. I went inside and told my husband we were not going to remove the garden. If she wanted a fight, she would get one. I did not yet know how far she was willing to go, but I was beginning to understand that she was the kind of person who never backed down, even when she was wrong. And I was starting to learn that grief, when cornered, can turn into something just as unyielding. By the time the official ultimatum arrived, there was nothing left to misunderstand about her intentions or the HOA's position. The letter came in a plain white envelope with the association's name printed neatly in the corner. Inside, the paper was heavy and smelled faintly of toner, the text perfectly centered as though the presentation mattered as much as the message. It stated in careful language that we were in violation of the community's landscaping standards, that the garden was considered an unapproved modification, and that we had exactly 14 days to remove all non-compliant elements. The words non-compliant elements stood out like a slap. It listed the bench, the tree, the plaque, and even specified certain flower beds that apparently disrupted the approved visual uniformity of the neighborhood. At the bottom, in small print, it warned that failure to comply would result in escalating daily fines and possible legal action to enforce compliance. I sat at the kitchen table reading it over and over until the words blurred. My husband read it once, set it down, and began pacing the kitchen. I could see the way his jaw tightened each time he passed the window and caught sight of the garden outside. For him, the bench was where he sat in the evenings with a beer and talked quietly to our son as though he might be listening. The thought of dismantling that space seemed to wound him as deeply as it did me, but the cold finality of the letter left little doubt that the HOA was not bluffing. We decided we had to try again to speak with them face to face. This time I prepared notes, not because I thought they would be swayed by logic or compassion, but because I wanted to make sure my voice did not falter. The next HOA meeting was held in the same small community room, but the atmosphere felt different from the last time. There were more residents present, some standing against the back wall. I noticed her immediately at the center of the board table, her posture perfectly upright, the same immaculate clothing and tight hair, her clipboard open in front of her. She did not look at me when I walked in. When it was my turn to speak, I began with the facts. I reminded them that the garden was on our property, not on shared land. I explained again what it represented, how it was not merely decoration but a memorial for a child who had been loved and lost. I spoke about the healing it had brought to us and to others who had visited it. I mentioned that several neighbors had expressed their appreciation for it, and I offered to collect signatures if that would make a difference. I asked them, as human beings, to allow it to remain. She waited until I had finished, and then leaned forward, resting her hands on the table, as though delivering a verdict. She thanked me again for sharing, her voice smooth and deliberate, and then said that while she sympathized with our loss, the board's role was to maintain the standards of the community for the benefit of all residents. Allowing our garden to remain would set a precedent that could lead to an array of unapproved structures and plantings, and that would undermine the cohesion of the neighborhood's appearance. She said it was not personal. She said rules had to apply equally to everyone. Her words landed like stones. There was no real discussion, no sign that anyone on the board was willing to challenge her. One man asked if there might be a compromise, perhaps allowing the garden with certain adjustments, but she dismissed the idea with a quick reminder that the bylaws did not provide for such exceptions. When the matter was put to a vote, the result was the same as before, only this time there was no abstention. Every hand except mine went up in favor of enforcing the removal. The following day we received another letter, this one summarizing the meeting and reiterating the 14-day deadline. It included a schedule of fines that would begin on the 15th day if the garden was still present. The amounts were not trivial, and the tone of the letter made it clear that the HOA would pursue every cent. My husband and I sat down with our budget, and the reality was sobering. Even a month of fines would hurt us badly, and if legal action followed, the costs could spiral. She knew this. I was certain. It was part of the pressure. I began to feel the scrutiny more acutely. Her car passed by almost daily now, sometimes slowing as she drove past the house, sometimes stopping altogether before continuing on. I saw her once at the corner speaking to another board member, both of them glancing in my direction before resuming their conversation. There were moments when I thought about giving in just to make it stop, but each time I looked at the garden, I felt that same quiet defiance take root in me. This was not just about flowers or a bench. It was about the right to grieve in my own way on my own property, without being treated as though my loss was a landscaping violation. We started to hear whispers from other residents. One woman I barely knew stopped me at the mailbox to say she thought what they were doing was cruel, but that she could not speak out because she had her own issues with the HOA and feared retaliation. Another neighbor said he admired that we were standing our ground, though he admitted he would never have the energy for a fight like this. It was becoming clear that she ruled the board with an iron will, and no one wanted to be her next target. The stress began to seep into every corner of our lives. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying conversations, imagining what I would say if confronted again. My husband grew quieter, spending more time alone in the garage or out in the yard. We both avoided the community center, knowing we would likely see her there. The garden, once a place of peace, now carried an undercurrent of tension. I still visited it each morning, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched. On the 12th day of the 14-day deadline, we received yet another reminder, this one printed in red ink across the top. Final notice before fines begin. There was no acknowledgement of our attempts to speak, no offer of mediation, just a blunt statement of consequences. I remember standing at the kitchen counter with that letter in my hands and feeling a surge of anger that was almost physical. It was not just that she wanted the garden gone. It was the way she seemed to strip it of meaning entirely, to treat it as nothing more than an obstacle to her idea of order. That night my husband and I talked late into the evening. We both knew we were running out of time. The fines would start soon, and then the legal notices would follow. We could not keep paying indefinitely, but we could not bring ourselves to dismantle the garden. We were at an impasse, and she knew it. It was then that I realized we might have to reach beyond the confines of the neighborhood for help, because inside this small circle she had all the power. And if we did not find someone willing to challenge her authority, we were going to lose. In the days after the final notice arrived, I began to feel the neighborhood itself shifting under my feet. It was not just the pressure from the HOA anymore. It was the way people seemed to move differently when I walked down the street. Some slowed their pace as if they might stop to talk, then glanced over their shoulders before deciding against it. Others waved quickly without breaking stride, their smiles brief and uneasy. There were still a few who spoke to me with warmth, but even they looked around as though checking to see who might be watching. It was a strange kind of isolation. I could see the signs of quiet support in small gestures. One morning, a fresh bouquet of flowers appeared on the bench in the garden, tied with a piece of ribbon. No note, just the flowers. Another day, a neighbor who rarely spoke more than a hello left a small candle at the base of the dogwood tree. These were acts of kindness, but they were also acts done in the shadows, as if those who offered them feared they might be punished for being too open about it. At the same time, there were others whose disapproval became bolder. A few times I caught people slowing their cars in front of the house, staring openly at the garden before driving away. Once, as I was watering the flowers, A man from down the block stopped on the sidewalk and asked whether I was really going to ignore the HOA's orders. His tone was not curious so much as accusatory, and when I told him the garden was staying, he shook his head and muttered something about rules being rules before walking off. I knew he was friendly with her, and I could not help but suspect the conversation would be repeated to her before the day was over. Social media became another battleground, though I had not expected it. A neighbor messaged me to say that people were posting about the garden in the neighborhood group. Some defended it, calling it beautiful and meaningful, while others complained that it set a dangerous precedent for people who might want to clutter their yards with all sorts of unapproved things. My husband warned me not to look, but I did. It was like reading a conversation about yourself in a room where you were not invited. My name was not used, but it did not need to be. Everyone knew who the posts were about. She was silent online, at least under her own name, but I could see her influence in the way certain people spoke. They used the same phrases she had used at the meetings, words like cohesion and precedent, as if those terms explained everything. A few even implied that we were trying to use our grief to get special treatment, and that hurt more than I expected. I wondered if she had said something like that in private conversations, planting the seed that we were manipulating the situation rather than simply trying to hold on to a piece of our son. The divide was not just between those who supported us and those who opposed us. There was a third group, perhaps the largest, made up of people who wanted nothing to do with any of it. They avoided eye contact, kept conversations shallow, and pretended not to notice the tension hanging over the street. I could not entirely blame them. Standing up to her came with consequences. I had begun to understand just how much power she wielded, not because of her position on the board, but because of the way she used it. One afternoon, I came home to find her standing with two other board members at the far end of the street. They were talking in low voices, and though they stopped when I approached, I could feel their eyes on me as I walked past. Later that evening, I overheard a couple of neighbors speaking in hushed tones while I was taking out the trash. They did not see me in the dark, but I heard enough to know they were discussing whether the HOA might start targeting other things if I refused to comply. The fear was spreading, and I could see how she might use it to isolate me further. Despite the tension, the garden itself remained untouched, and in those moments when I was alone there, I could almost forget the fight surrounding it. The flowers were in full bloom, the air was thick with the scent of lavender, and the dogwood's leaves made a soft rustling sound in the breeze. But even in those peaceful moments, I was aware that every petal, every stone, every inch of the bench was under scrutiny. I began to notice tiny details I had overlooked before, like the way the plaque caught the sunlight in the late afternoon, or how the marigolds seemed to lean toward the sidewalk, as if inviting passers-by to come closer. It made me wonder how anyone could look at it and see only a violation instead of a gift. As the deadline drew nearer, the unspoken division among neighbors became sharper. A few more left tokens in the garden. Someone placed a small wind chime in the branches of the dogwood one night, and I found it the next morning swaying gently in the wind. Another left a smooth stone painted with a bright blue butterfly. These acts of quiet rebellion gave me strength, but they also underscored the fact that those who supported us were still afraid to stand in the open. One evening, as the sun was setting and the street was bathed in gold, a woman I barely knew knocked on the door. She stepped inside quickly, as if not wanting to be seen, and handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a list of names, neighbors who had agreed to sign a petition to keep the garden. She whispered that she had been asking quietly for days but did not want anyone to know she was involved. I thanked her, and she left without even taking a seat. It was a reminder that while the opposition was loud, the support was there, waiting for someone strong enough to gather it. Still, the isolation wore on us. My husband avoided certain streets on his evening walks because he did not want to pass the homes of those we knew were against us. I found myself skipping neighborhood events, unwilling to stand in a circle of small talk while pretending nothing was happening. The garden had once been a place to bring people together, and now it had become the line that divided them. It was around this time that I began to think seriously about reaching out for help beyond the neighborhood. I knew we could not keep this fight contained here forever. She had too much sway, and the board followed her lead without question. If we wanted to keep the garden, we would need someone who could shift the balance of power, someone she could not ignore or intimidate. I thought about it for several days, weighing the risks. Once we took the fight outside the neighborhood, there would be no going back to quiet. But the truth was, quiet had already left us. On the night I made the decision, I stood in the garden after dark, the air cool and still. The flowers were pale shapes in the dim light, the bench a shadow beneath the dogwood. I placed my hand on the plaque, tracing the letters of our son's name, and felt a steadiness I had not felt in weeks. The garden was worth every ounce of effort, every uncomfortable glance, every whispered conversation. It was more than a piece of landscaping. It was a promise. And if I had to fight the entire neighborhood to keep it, then so be it. The fines began exactly as the letter had promised, arriving on the 15th day with mechanical precision. The first notice was delivered in the morning mail, printed on the same heavy paper as the previous warnings, only this time the tone was sharper. It listed the amount owed for the first day of non-compliance, along with a schedule for how the total would increase each day the garden remained in place. The figure was not enough to break us on its own, but the thought of it repeating day after day was like a steady leak in the hull of a ship. We could see where it would lead if left unchecked. My husband stared at the letter for a long time before setting it down without a word. It did not stop with the fines. By the end of that first week, 2 more notices had arrived, each with a higher total than the last. The HOA's office was only a short walk from our home, yet the letters always came by post, as though to reinforce their official weight. There was something almost taunting about the way the envelopes appeared in the box, each one a reminder that we were losing a financial battle even as we held our ground in a personal one. Then came the notes that were not from the HOA. The first was tucked under the welcome mat. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smudged, and the words were blunt. Take it down before it gets ugly. There was no signature. I showed it to my husband, and we argued for a moment about whether it was worth calling the police. In the end, we decided against it. Without a name or proof, there was nothing they could do, and the thought of making a formal complaint felt like it would only feed the tension. A few days later, another note appeared. This one slipped under the windshield wiper of my car while it was parked in the driveway. It said simply, "You are ruining this neighborhood." I stood there holding it in the early morning light, the cool air brushing my face, and felt a hollow anger settle in my chest. Whoever wrote it had been close enough to touch the car, close enough to see the inside of our home through the windows. The intimacy of the intrusion made me uneasy, in a way the official letters never had. She kept her distance physically, but her presence was constant. I would see her walking the street in the early evenings, sometimes with a dog, sometimes alone, always with that same upright posture and measured pace. When she passed the house, her gaze would linger on the garden just long enough to remind me she was keeping track. The board meetings continued as usual, but I stopped attending. There was nothing to gain from sitting in that room while she recited rules and the others nodded along. The strain began to seep into daily life in ways I had not anticipated. My husband grew irritable, snapping at small things that never used to bother him. I found myself avoiding certain chores just to keep from going outside, where I might encounter another disapproving stare. The garden itself, once a source of calm, now carried a strange tension. I still tended to it, but my movements were quicker, my eyes darting to the street at every sound of footsteps or a car engine slowing. One evening, we returned home from the grocery store to find a small section of the flower bed trampled. The damage was not extensive, but it was deliberate. The soil was freshly disturbed, and several marigolds lay crushed. My husband's hands clenched at his sides as he surveyed the damage. We both knew it was unlikely to be an accident. The idea that someone had stepped into our yard, into that space, to make their point in such a petty and destructive way made my stomach turn. We cleaned up the damage and replanted what we could, but the act left a mark. From that night on, my husband began checking the garden before we went to bed, walking the perimeter with a flashlight as though guarding it against unseen intruders. It felt ridiculous at first, but after the next letter from the HOA arrived with yet another increase in the fine, I found myself joining him, both of us moving in the cool night air, listening for the smallest sound. The harassment became part of our routine, as strange as that sounds. The official notices arrived in the mail. The occasional anonymous note appeared without warning. The sideways glances from certain neighbors became as predictable as the sunrise. It was as if we had been assigned roles in a play we had not agreed to join, and no matter how much we wanted to leave the stage, we were locked in our parts. There were moments, though, when kindness broke through. A neighbor I barely knew slipped a small paper bag into my hands one afternoon, saying only that it was for the garden. Inside was a packet of seeds and a short note that read, "Your garden matters." I kept that note in the drawer of the kitchen desk, and on difficult days I would take it out and read it again. It was a reminder that even in the midst of hostility, there were still people who saw the garden for what it truly was. Still, the weight of it all was beginning to take its toll. We spoke in circles late at night, trying to decide whether to give in, to dismantle the garden ourselves before the fines became impossible to manage. Each time we reached that point, one of us would find a reason to hold on a little longer. For me, it was the memory of my son's laughter in the backyard. For my husband, it was the way the dogwood tree had begun to spread its branches, as if claiming its place in the yard. On the 22nd day of fines, I found myself standing in the community center parking lot after running an errand nearby. Her car was there, parked in the spot closest to the entrance, the license plate gleaming in the sunlight. I could hear her voice inside the building, carrying through the open door as she spoke to someone. I could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, that clipped precision she used when stating facts she knew could not be challenged. For a moment, I considered walking in, standing in front of her, and asking her directly why she was doing this, what she hoped to gain. But I knew it would not matter. She would say it was not personal. She would say it was about the rules. When I returned home that day, there was another letter waiting in the mailbox. This one was marked as a final demand for payment of accumulated fines. The amount was no longer just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. My husband sat at the table with the letter in front of him, rubbing his temples. We both knew we had reached a point where something had to change. Continuing like this was not sustainable. That night, lying awake in the dark, I realized that fighting her on her terms was a battle we could not win. The HOA's structure, the fines, the endless letters, all of it was designed to exhaust us into submission. If we were going to keep the garden, we needed to change the field entirely. We needed someone who could step into this fight from the outside, someone whose presence would carry a weight she could not dismiss with a wave of her hand. It was then that I thought of him, the man who had stood beside us on the worst day of our lives, the one who had promised to be a godfather in more than name. I had not wanted to involve him because his life was already full of demands, and because I did not want our grief to become public in a way we could not control. But as I lay there listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of leaves outside, I understood that this was not just about grief anymore. It was about standing against a kind of cruelty that dressed itself in the language of order, and if anyone could force her to see that, it was him. I had not spoken to him in several months, though we exchanged occasional texts, and he had sent flowers for what would have been my son's birthday. The distance was not because we had grown apart, but because grief had made me withdraw from most people. He was one of the few who had not pushed me to be present before I was ready, and I had been grateful for that. But the night after we received the final demand for payment, I scrolled through my phone until I found his name. I stared at it for a long time before pressing call. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and steady, the same as it had been years ago when he had stood beside me and promised to be a godfather in more than name. I told him I was sorry to be calling so late, and he said he was glad to hear from me no matter the hour. I tried to explain the situation as simply as I could, though the words felt clumsy in my mouth. I told him about the garden, the fines, the letters, and the way the Homeowners Association had made it clear they would not stop until it was gone. There was a pause after I finished, the kind of pause that feels heavy with thought rather than hesitation. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharper than I had heard it in a long time. He asked me to go back and tell him exactly what they had said in the first letter, then the second, then the final notice. He wanted dates, amounts, and any mention of rules or bylaws. I pulled the stack of letters from the desk drawer and began reading them aloud, my voice shaking at first but growing steadier as I went on. By the time I finished, he was silent again, but this time I could hear the controlled anger in the way he breathed. He asked if I had considered bringing it to the media. I told him I had thought about it but worried it would make things worse. He said sometimes worse in the short term was worth it in the long term, especially if the alternative was losing something that mattered. I reminded him that the Homeowners Association seemed immune to reason, and that the woman leading the charge against us was unrelenting. He asked her name, and when I told him, I could almost hear him filing it away in his mind. Then he said something I had not expected. He told me he was going to look into it personally. He was not talking about sending an aide or writing a letter. He meant himself. I protested at first, saying his schedule was too full, that this was too small a matter for him to get involved in. He cut me off gently, but firmly. He reminded me that he was not just a public official but my son's godfather, and that his promise to stand by us had not expired when the funeral ended. Over the next few days, he called twice more, each time asking for more information. He wanted the exact wording of the plaque, photographs of the garden from different angles, and a copy of the Homeowners Association's bylaws. I sent everything he asked for, feeling a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. I did not know what he intended to do, only that he was moving with purpose. Meanwhile, the pressure from the HOA did not ease. Another letter arrived warning that legal action was imminent if payment was not made within the next 10 days. My husband was beginning to look at the numbers more grimly, calculating what it would mean to pay the fines while continuing to resist. I kept telling him that help was coming, though I had no clear picture yet of what form it would take. On the fourth evening after our first call, he phoned to tell me he would be attending the next Homeowners Association meeting in person. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. I asked if he meant that he would be sending someone on his behalf. He said no. He meant himself. I tried to explain what the meetings were like. The small room, the folding chairs, the tight cluster of board members led by her at the center. He laughed quietly and said he had been in rooms far less friendly than that. Word travels fast in a neighborhood, and by the time the day of the meeting arrived, I could feel the buzz of it. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me in months were suddenly making small talk at the mailbox or pausing to ask what time the meeting started. I said very little, not because I wanted to keep it secret, but because I knew that speculation could easily turn into rumor. Even so, I had no doubt that she had heard. Her car passed by the house twice that morning, slower than usual, and when our eyes met briefly, her expression was unreadable. That evening, as I walked toward the community center, my stomach churned with a nervous energy I had not felt since before the garden had even been planted. The air was heavy with the smell of cut grass, and the sound of voices carried through the open door ahead of me. Inside, the room was more crowded than I had ever seen it. People lined the walls, and there was a low hum of conversation that stopped almost instantly when he walked in. He wore a simple dark suit, nothing flashy, but the air in the room shifted as soon as he appeared. He greeted me first, pulling me into a brief embrace, and then turned his attention to the board. She was seated in her usual place at the center, her hands folded neatly on the table. For the first time since this began, I saw her hesitate. It was small, just a flicker in her expression, but it was there. He introduced himself not by title but by name, making it clear that he was here as a private citizen and as the godfather of the boy whose memory the garden honored. He asked for permission to speak, and when it was granted, he began by thanking the board for their service to the community. Then, without raising his voice, he asked them to explain the reasoning behind the order to remove the garden. He listened without interrupting as she repeated the same phrases I had heard so many times before about cohesion and precedent. When she finished, he paused for a moment before asking her to point out exactly which bylaw prohibited the garden as it currently stood. She reached for a binder, flipping through pages with an eagerness that made it clear she expected to find her answer quickly. But the more she turned the pages, the more deliberate her movements became. Finally, she read aloud a clause about unapproved modifications, but he interrupted to point out that the clause applied to structures, not plantings, and that the bench did not meet the definition of a structure under state law. He said it so matter-of-factly that several people in the audience murmured. He went on to explain that state law provided protections for memorials on private property, protections that superseded any homeowners association bylaw. His tone remained calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. He was not arguing with her. He was stating facts she could not easily dismiss. By the time he finished, the room was silent except for the sound of someone shifting in their chair. She did not meet his gaze, and I could see her fingers tightening around her pen. He thanked the board for their time and sat down beside me. The meeting continued with other agenda items, but the air had changed. I could feel it in the way people glanced at him, then at me, as if trying to reconcile the sight of a state leader in their modest community center with the fight over a small garden. When the meeting ended, several neighbors approached us quietly, some to shake his hand, others to offer quick words of support before slipping out the door. She left quickly, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. My husband, who had been silent most of the evening, leaned over as we walked out and whispered that for the first time in weeks, he felt like we might actually win. The meeting that followed a week later was unlike any other I had seen in that room. Word had spread beyond the neighborhood now. A local reporter had shown up after hearing that a state leader had attended an HOA gathering, and the story had circulated on social media. By the time the date rolled around, the tension in the air was heavy enough to feel in my chest. People who had not attended an HOA meeting in years came that night, and the folding chairs were filled before the scheduled start time. Those who arrived late stood in the back, their faces curious and expectant. I arrived with my husband, my stomach in knots, unsure of what exactly would happen. He was already there when we walked in, seated in one of the chairs along the side of the room. He rose when we approached, greeting us with the same warm firmness that had steadied me the week before. There was no speech, no whisper of strategy. His presence was enough to make me feel we were no longer cornered. She was already in her place at the head of the board table, flanked by the other members, her clipboard resting squarely in front of her. She glanced up as we entered, her expression calm but her eyes sharper than usual. She did not acknowledge him this time, and I could see that she was preparing for a confrontation she could no longer avoid. When the meeting was called to order, she moved through the agenda briskly, almost as though she hoped to reach the topic of the garden and deal with it as quickly as possible. But he raised his hand before she could steer the discussion past the point. She tried to tell him that the public comment period would be later, but his voice was even as he said he would be speaking now because the issue at hand involved ongoing fines and a potential legal dispute that affected the rights of homeowners. The room went still, the quiet stretching long enough to make it clear that he had seized control of the moment. He began by summarizing the situation in terms that were direct and impossible to distort. He described the memorial garden as a private tribute on private property, noted that it did not violate any clear provision in the bylaws, and explained that state law protected memorials from exactly the kind of enforcement action the HOA was attempting. He did not raise his voice, but each sentence carried the weight of someone used to speaking in settings where every word mattered. The board members listened with varying expressions, some clearly uneasy, others keeping their eyes down as if afraid to be drawn into the conversation. When he finished, she leaned forward, her fingers tapping the edge of her clipboard. She repeated her familiar points about cohesion and precedent, about the dangers of allowing one exception that might lead to many more. But the words did not carry the same authority they once had. She was not speaking to a room of people who deferred to her without question. She was speaking to someone who knew the law better than she did, and who was willing to challenge her interpretation openly. He asked her to explain, point by point, how the garden constituted a violation. She began to recite the clause about unapproved modifications, but he interrupted gently to note that the clause was vague and that such vagueness could be challenged legally. He then asked if the board had ever issued removal orders for other plantings or benches on private property. There was a long pause before she admitted that they had not. That answer was followed by a murmur from the audience, a low ripple of awareness passing through the room. He took that moment to speak not just to her but to everyone present. He said that rules exist to protect a community, not to strip it of compassion or to punish its members for honoring those they loved. He reminded them that the role of an HOA was to preserve the character of a neighborhood, and that nothing was more central to character than the way people treated each other in times of grief. She tried to cut him off, saying that the matter had been decided in previous votes, but he countered by pointing out that votes taken in violation of state law could be nullified. His voice never rose, but there was an unmistakable finality in his tone. The tension in the room shifted again, and I saw several of the board members exchange glances that suggested their certainty was beginning to fracture. The reporter in the back scribbled notes furiously, occasionally glancing up to watch the exchange. I knew that whatever happened in that room would not stay there now. The presence of the press meant that her words could be repeated to a wider audience, and that any misstep could follow her beyond the neighborhood. For the first time since this had begun, she looked like she might be feeling the weight of the spotlight. My husband sat beside me, silent but alert, his eyes moving between her and the man who had stepped into our fight. I could feel the tension in him, the barely contained mix of anger and relief. We had been speaking in our own defense for weeks with no one listening, and now, With every sentence he delivered, it felt as though the walls of resistance were beginning to crack. When she tried again to end the discussion, he asked for a motion to suspend enforcement of the fines until the legality of the order could be reviewed by an independent party. It was a direct challenge, and for a moment, no one moved. Then one of the board members on her right hesitated before raising a hand in support. Another followed. The motion did not carry a majority yet, but the break in her control was visible. She pressed her lips together, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the clipboard. He did not gloat, did not press the moment harder than necessary. Instead, he turned back to the audience and reminded them that their voices mattered, that the HOA existed to serve the residents, not to impose unnecessary burdens on them. He encouraged them to speak up if they felt something was wrong, to make their presence known at meetings, and to hold their elected board members accountable. By the time the meeting moved on to other topics, the energy in the room had changed entirely. People who had been silent in previous gatherings were leaning toward one another, whispering and shaking their heads. The board members seemed distracted, their attention wandering from the routine business in front of them. She tried to resume her usual steady control, but I could see the cracks forming in the way she shuffled her papers and avoided his gaze. When the meeting ended, a cluster of neighbors approached me, some speaking in low voices about how they had never realized the bylaws could be challenged, others offering quiet congratulations. He shook hands with several people, speaking to them with the same respect and focus he had shown in the meeting. She left quickly again, her head held high, but her pace faster than before. Outside, the cool night air felt different, lighter somehow, as if a storm had passed even though the fight was not yet over. My husband turned to me with a look I had not seen in weeks, one that carried hope instead of exhaustion. He said that it was the first time he believed we might not have to tear down the garden after all. I looked at the man who had stepped into our struggle and told him that no matter the outcome, I would never forget what he had done for us that night. He smiled, not in the way of someone accepting thanks, but in the way of someone who believes the fight is far from finished and is ready to see it through. In that moment, I knew that the tide had shifted for good. The morning after the meeting, my phone began buzzing before I had even poured my first cup of coffee. At first, I thought it might be friends checking in, but when I glanced at the screen, I saw notifications from people I had not heard from in years. There were links to news articles, messages with screenshots, and short videos clipped from the meeting. Someone in the back of the room had recorded the exchange between her and my son's godfather, and the clip had already been shared across several local social media pages. The footage showed her sitting at the head of the table, struggling to locate the exact bylaw she had cited so confidently before, and then it cut to him explaining that state law protected memorials on private property. His calm, steady delivery contrasted sharply with her clipped responses. Watching it from the outside, even I could feel the shift in authority that had happened in the room. The comments beneath the video were overwhelmingly in our favor. People who did not live anywhere near our neighborhood were calling her petty and heartless, while others praised him for taking the time to stand up for a grieving family. By mid-morning, one of the local television stations had posted their own segment about the story. The piece included a brief interview with him outside the community center, where he spoke about compassion, the importance of honoring those who had passed, and the role of the law in protecting personal rights. They also interviewed a few neighbors, most of whom chose to speak without showing their faces, citing fear of retaliation. Even without their names or faces, their words carried weight. They talked about the beauty of the garden, about how it had become a quiet space for reflection, and about their discomfort with the way the homeowners association had handled the matter. The pressure began to mount almost immediately. That afternoon, the HOA office was flooded with calls and emails, many from people outside the neighborhood demanding to know why they were targeting a memorial. By evening, the same video from the meeting had been shared by a regional news site, and I heard from a cousin 2 states away who had seen it on her feed. My husband and I sat on the couch watching the story spread, part of me still in disbelief that what had once been a small, private fight on our street had become a subject of public conversation. Not everyone was supportive, of course. A handful of comments defended the HOA, arguing that rules were rules and that exceptions should not be made for anyone. I suspected some of those voices belonged to people in our own neighborhood, though it was hard to say for sure. She herself remained silent publicly, but I noticed her car parked in front of the HOA office for much longer than usual that day, and I imagined the conversations happening inside. The days that followed brought more attention. Another television crew showed up and asked if we would be willing to talk on camera. I hesitated at first, worried about putting our family's grief into such a public forum, but my husband reminded me that the narrative was already out there. If we did not tell our own story, someone else would tell it for us. We agreed to speak, and the reporter filmed us in the garden. I talked about our son, about how the garden had been a way to keep his memory alive, and about how painful it had been to see that tribute treated like a code violation. My husband spoke about the way the fight had divided the neighborhood and the importance of compassion in community decisions. When the segment aired that evening, it was more powerful than I had expected. They showed close-ups of the flowers, the plaque, and the bench, letting the visuals speak alongside our words. The station paired our interview with footage from the meeting and a short statement from him about the legal protections for memorials. The story ended with a note that the HOA had declined to comment. That silence did not serve them well. Online, the lack of any defense or explanation only fueled more outrage. People began tagging the HOA's official page in posts, demanding answers. Some even started a petition calling for changes to the bylaws to explicitly protect memorial gardens. The petition gained hundreds of signatures in just a few days, many from outside the neighborhood but plenty from within it as well. I recognized several names on the list as neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before. Her control over the board seemed to weaken with each passing day. At the grocery store, I overheard two residents talking in the produce aisle, their voices low but their words unmistakable. One of them said they were tired of being embarrassed by the way the situation had been handled. The other said they hoped she would step down before the next election. I pretended to be examining a stack of apples, listening without letting on. The change was visible in smaller ways, too. People who had avoided me for weeks began making eye contact again, some even stopping to chat when I was out in the yard. One neighbor who had been silent throughout the ordeal walked over with a plate of cookies and told me that seeing the story on the news had made her realize how wrong it was for the board to treat us the way they had. She apologized for not saying anything sooner. Despite the shift in public opinion, I knew she would not give in easily. The fines had been suspended after the motion in the last meeting, but there had been no official reversal of the removal order. The next board meeting was still a week away, and until then, the garden's fate remained technically undecided. Still, the tide had turned so completely that I could not imagine them trying to push forward with enforcement. He called a few days before the meeting to check in. His tone was lighter this time, though still focused. He said the coverage had been more effective than he expected and that the legal grounds for keeping the garden were now too public to ignore. He also said he planned to attend the upcoming meeting again, just to make sure the matter was settled properly. I thanked him, though words still felt inadequate for what he had done. In the meantime, the garden continued to thrive. The weather had been kind that week, and the blooms seemed brighter than they had all season. Visitors began stopping by. Not just neighbors, but strangers who had read about the story and wanted to see the place for themselves. Some left flowers, others simply stood quietly for a moment before walking away. It was humbling to watch, a reminder that the garden's meaning extended beyond our own family now. The day before the meeting, a final ripple of publicity hit when one of the news stations ran a follow-up segment. This time, they focused on the community's response, showing the petition numbers and interviewing a few residents on camera. Several of them spoke plainly about their support for the garden and their frustration with how the HOA had handled the situation. One woman said she had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years and had never seen people come together like this before. That night, as I sat on the bench under the dogwood tree, I felt something I had not felt in months. It was not just relief or hope. It was a sense of belonging, the kind I thought we had lost when the first letter arrived in the mail. Whatever happened in the meeting the next day, I knew we had already won in a way that mattered. The garden was no longer just ours. It belonged to everyone who had stood up, spoken out, or quietly left a token among the flowers. And that, more than anything, made me believe it would endure. The community center was already buzzing when we arrived for the next meeting. The air inside the small room felt warmer than usual, heavy with the murmurs of people finding their seats and the scrape of folding chairs being dragged into place. The crowd was even larger than at the last two gatherings, with residents spilling into the hallway outside. A few members of the press were there again, their cameras resting on tripods at the back. The scent of coffee from a table in the corner mixed with the faint smell of floor polish, creating a strange backdrop for what I knew was about to unfold. She was in her usual spot at the center of the long table, her clipboard resting in front of her, and her hands folded neatly on top of it. Her posture was rigid, and she kept her eyes on the papers in front of her rather than on the crowd. The other board members sat on either side of her, some shifting in their seats and others glancing toward the door as if expecting something. When he walked in, the room shifted in the way it always did when his presence filled a space. He moved through the rows of chairs with a steady, unhurried pace, nodding to a few people he recognized. I watched as he greeted the reporter from the television station with a handshake before taking a seat near the front, close enough to be seen but far enough to let the proceedings begin without looking as though he intended to dominate them. My husband sat beside me, his hand brushing mine briefly, a silent reassurance that whatever happened, we were not facing it alone. The meeting began with the usual reading of the minutes from the last session, but no one was truly listening. All eyes and ears were on the part of the agenda labeled Ongoing Compliance Matters, which everyone knew was code for our garden. When they reached that item, she cleared her throat and began to speak in the same clipped, controlled voice she always used. She said the board had reviewed the situation and the legal arguments presented at the previous meeting. She said that while she understood the public interest, the HOA's role was to enforce the community's standards without favoritism or exception. Before she could continue, he raised his hand. She paused for a fraction of a second before acknowledging him. His voice was calm as he asked if the board had obtained legal counsel on the matter since the last meeting. She said they had consulted with their attorney. He then asked if that attorney had confirmed whether state law provided protections for memorials on private property. She hesitated before saying that the attorney had noted such protections existed, but that they could be subject to interpretation. That was all he needed to hear. He reminded the board that the protections were clearly written into law and that challenging them would not only waste the association's resources, but would almost certainly result in a loss. He went further this time, saying that pursuing enforcement against a grieving family in the face of clear legal protections could be viewed as harassment, something no board should risk. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and the sound of a pen clicking at the board's table made it clear some of the members were feeling the pressure. She tried to steer the conversation back to the question of precedent, repeating her argument that allowing one exception could open the door to others. He countered that exceptions had already been made, citing instances from the association's own records, where residents had installed features without formal approval and had never been asked to remove them. His voice remained steady, but his words left little room for rebuttal. She glanced toward the other board members, perhaps looking for support, but their faces were unreadable. A motion was then introduced by one of the quieter board members, a man who had said little during the entire ordeal. He proposed that the removal order be rescinded entirely and that the fines already issued be nullified. Another member quickly seconded the motion. The suddenness of it seemed to catch her off guard. She tried to remind them of procedure, saying that such a decision should be tabled for further discussion, but the mood in the room had shifted. The residents who had filled the chairs and lined the walls leaned forward, clearly eager to see a resolution. The discussion that followed was short but charged. A few members voiced support for keeping the garden, citing the overwhelming public response and the legal considerations. Only one member spoke in defense of the removal order, and even that argument sounded half-hearted. She spoke last, reiterating her concerns and warning that the decision could come back to haunt the board. Her tone was still measured, but I could hear the strain in it, as if she knew she was no longer speaking from a position of strength. The vote was called. Hands went up around the table, one after another, until it was clear the motion would pass. My heart pounded in my chest as I counted them. When the final tally was read aloud, it was official. The removal order was gone. The fines were erased. The garden was ours to keep. A ripple of applause spread through the room, hesitant at first, and then stronger as more people joined in. My husband squeezed my hand, his eyes bright with a mix of relief and disbelief. She did not clap. She simply lowered her gaze to her clipboard and began shuffling papers as though the meeting needed to move on immediately. The applause faded into a low hum of conversation, and the next item on the agenda was introduced, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. People were smiling at us, some leaning over to shake our hands or whisper congratulations. When the meeting adjourned, I stood and turned toward him. He was smiling, but it was the quiet, satisfied kind that comes from knowing the work is done. I thanked him again, my words stumbling over themselves, and he brushed them off with a small shake of his head. He said it had been the right thing to do, nothing more. My husband clasped his shoulder in silent gratitude, and the three of us walked out into the cool evening together. Outside, small clusters of neighbors lingered on the steps and in the parking lot. The press was there again, asking for comments, but I waved them off, not ready to speak beyond what had already been said. I wanted to go home, to walk through the gate into the garden, and to sit on the bench knowing it was truly safe. As we made our way down the path, I caught sight of her leaving through a side door, her clipboard tucked tightly under her arm. She walked quickly toward her car without looking back. The night air smelled of rain on the horizon, and the breeze carried the faint scent of the flowers from our yard even from that distance. As we reached our car, my husband turned to me and said it was over. I nodded, though part of me knew that while the battle had ended, the memory of it would linger. But in that moment, what mattered was that the garden had been saved, not just by legal arguments or public pressure, but by the combined will of those who had decided enough was enough. When we arrived home, we went straight to the garden. The dogwood's leaves shifted softly in the wind, and the flowers glowed faintly in the light from the house. I sat on the bench, my hand resting on the plaque, and for the first time in months, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease completely. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it had also shown me that even in the face of relentless opposition, it was possible to hold on to something worth protecting. In the weeks that followed the vote, the neighborhood settled into a quieter rhythm. The garden was no longer the subject of tense meetings or whispered debates. People passed by without glancing over their shoulders first, and I began to notice more smiles offered in passing, some tentative, others warm and genuine. The air around our home felt lighter, as though a long stretch of storm clouds had finally moved on. The first weekend after the decision, I spent an entire Saturday in the garden. The sky was bright but not harsh, with a soft wind that made the leaves of the dogwood whisper above me. I planted a few new flowers, small bursts of color that filled in the spaces left from the earlier damage. As I worked, neighbors stopped to chat. One woman who had kept her distance for months approached with a shy smile and told me she was glad the garden was staying. She said she had walked past many times but had never felt comfortable stopping to look. Now she felt she could. Another neighbor offered to help water the plants when we traveled. There were still people who avoided me, but their silence no longer carried the same weight. Without the power of the board behind her, her influence had faded. She was seen less often in the streets, and when she did appear, her pace was brisk, her eyes fixed straight ahead. I heard from a few people that she had resigned from the board, citing personal reasons. No official announcement was made, and she did not say goodbye. Her absence was noted quietly, with little ceremony, as though everyone knew the real reason but no one needed to speak it aloud. The garden began to attract more visitors than ever before. Some came in the mornings, walking slowly between the beds and pausing at the bench. Others stopped in the evenings, often just to sit for a moment before continuing on their way. A few left flowers or small tokens. One morning I found a folded note tucked under a stone at the base of the tree. It was from someone I did not know, thanking us for creating a place that felt peaceful in a busy world. I found myself spending more time outside again, no longer scanning the street for her car or bracing for another letter. The simple acts of tending the plants and sweeping the path felt different now. They were no longer acts of defiance. They were acts of care, carried out in the open without the shadow of removal hanging over them. My husband returned to his evening routine of sitting on the bench after dinner, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the light change as the sun dipped behind the houses. The local press moved on to other stories, but every so often someone would bring it up again, usually as an example of how a small act of community resistance could make a difference. The video from that pivotal meeting still floated around online, and I would occasionally receive messages from people saying they had stumbled across it and wanted to tell me they admired the stand we had taken. I was never quite sure how to respond beyond a simple thank you. It felt strange to be recognized for something that had grown so deeply out of personal loss. One afternoon, I saw him again when he stopped by unannounced. He had been in the area for a different reason, but he said he could not resist checking in on the garden. We walked through it together, and I showed him the new flowers, the small wind chime someone had hung in the dogwood, and the painted stones that had appeared along the edge of one bed. He stood quietly for a moment, his gaze on the plaque, and then he told me he was proud of how we had held on. I told him it would not have been possible without him, and though he brushed off the praise, I could see in his eyes that he understood what it had meant to us. Seasons began to turn, and with them the garden changed. The bright summer colors softened into the deeper tones of autumn. Leaves from the dogwood fell gently onto the bench, and I let them rest there for a time before sweeping them away. The air grew cooler, and the scent of lavender faded into the background. Winter would come soon enough, but I knew now that the garden would endure it, just as it had endured everything else. There were still reminders of the fight, though they came in quieter ways. I would sometimes pass the community center and remember the tension in that room, the way her voice had carried in those first meetings, the way I had felt so small sitting at the back. Those memories did not sting as sharply as they once had, but they had not faded entirely. They were a reminder of what it had taken to keep the garden, of the days when each letter in the mailbox carried a weight that settled heavily on my chest. Yet there was a sense of balance now. The struggle had shaped not just the garden's place in the neighborhood, but my own place in it. I felt more rooted than before, more certain of my right to claim space and to protect what mattered. I saw the same change in my husband. He carried himself with a steadier confidence, as if the act of standing firm had left a permanent mark on him too. One evening in early winter, I sat on the bench with a cup of tea, the steam curling into the cold air. The sky was pale and clear, and the last light of the day turned the bare branches of the dogwood into a dark silhouette against the fading blue. I thought about my son, about the laughter that used to fill this space, about the quiet that had followed, and the garden that had grown in its place. I thought about the people who had passed through here since then. Some I knew well, and others I might never see again, each leaving something of themselves behind. The fight with the HOA had been a chapter I would never have chosen, but it had also been one that revealed more than I expected. It had shown me the quiet strength of neighbors willing to act in small but meaningful ways. It had shown me that even in the face of rules and authority, compassion could still find its way through. And it had shown me that the promises made in love, like the one my son's godfather had kept, could hold their ground against almost anything. I stayed on the bench until the cold began to settle into my hands, then rose and walked slowly back toward the house. The garden was behind me, but its presence followed, steady and sure. It would be there tomorrow, and the next day, and the next season, changing but enduring. The fight was over, but the promise it had protected was still alive, rooted deep in the soil and in the hearts of those who had cared enough to keep it.